The old woman slowly stepped toward the center of the room. Her eyes fixed on the darkness behind me. Then, in a hushed whisper, she said, "I lived here alone, but I was never alone." I woke up in a panic, my breath ragged. I couldn't go back to sleep. She wasn't just a nightmare. She is here. They are here. I can feel them. My name is Jason. I am now 36 years old. I have an old story that I really want to share it with you. It was my first day in the new house. After years of moving from one rental apartment to another, I had finally decided to buy a home of my own. It was a small house overlooking a quiet street in a town that felt frozen in time. The walls were filled with history and the wooden floors creaked under every step. I was excited, though I felt a slight sense of loneliness. I had no family and I wasn't close to my friends, but I believed this house would be a new beginning. On the first night, as I unpacked boxes in the living room, I noticed something strange. Across the street, in the abandoned house opposite mine, a faint light flickered in one of the windows. I wasn't sure if it was a lamp or something else. I moved closer to my window for a better look. And that's when I saw her. An old woman stood behind the glass. She wore an antique dress, her white hair draping over her shoulders. She was staring directly at me, as if she knew I was watching. A cold sweat formed on my forehead. I hesitantly raised a hand to wave, but she didn't move. She just stood there, staring. After a few minutes, I turned off my lights and stepped away from the window, trying to convince myself that she was just a harmless old woman, curious about her new neighbor. But it didn't stop there. In the following days, I saw the old woman repeatedly. She always appeared at the same window, at the same time, every night. Sometimes she held something, a book or a framed photo. My curiosity grew, but fear kept me from getting closer. I tried to ignore her, but her presence began to creep into my dreams. One night, I dreamt of her for the first time. I was standing in a dark room, the air freezing around me. Suddenly, she appeared, clearer than ever before. I was paralyzed, unable to move. She looked directly at me and whispered, "You see me. You must know the truth." Then, she vanished. I woke up gasping, unable to shake off the terror. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay awake, replaying her words over and over. What truth? Why me? I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but it felt too real. The next day, I went about my routine, trying to forget. But her image haunted me. Her eyes. They weren't just watching me. They were warning me. That evening, I found myself glancing at the opposite window again. I wondered if she would appear, but she didn't. Instead, she came to me in my dreams. This time, I was inside her abandoned house. The room was filled with dust, old furniture covered in white sheets. The old woman stood in the center, clutching a photograph in her hands. She looked at me and said, "I lived here alone, but I was never alone." I hesitated before asking, "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the darkness behind her. Something was moving. At first, I couldn't make it out, but slowly, a face began to emerge from the shadows, pale, almost invisible, but its smile was impossible to ignore. A grin stretched from ear to ear, unnaturally wide. Its lips were thin and wrinkled, as if they had never smiled before. Yet now, they were stretched to their limit. Then, suddenly, I heard it. Screams. Blood-curdling screams filled with pain and horror echoed all around me. It was like they came from everywhere at once, piercing my ears. The screams belonged to Martha, but they didn't sound like they came from this world. They were distant, as if reaching me from another reality. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound crawled through my hands, sinking deep into my bones. The screams grew louder. They weren't just noise. They were a warning. And then, suddenly they stopped. The silence that followed was far worse. I turned back to Martha, but she was gone. All that remained was that pale face in the darkness, still smiling, a smile that didn't belong in this world, a smile that told me, without words, it knows me, and it's waiting. I woke up trembling, my chest heaving as if I had been running for hours. Sleep was no longer an option. I stayed awake, staring into the darkness of my room, terrified that when I blinked, I'd see that smiling face again. After days of these dreams, I decided to talk to my neighbor, Mrs. Brown, who lived in the house next to mine. She was a woman in her 70s, living alone with her cat. When I told her about the old woman in the window and the dreams, she froze, stopping midway while cleaning her window, then looked at me in shock. "Martha," she whispered. "Are you talking about Martha?" "Yes, I think so." "Who is Martha?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. Mrs. Brown spoke in a low, broken voice. Martha was an old woman who lived in that abandoned house more than 20 years ago. She lived alone, had no family, no friends. She died alone in that house, and her body wasn't discovered for weeks. Since then, the house has remained abandoned, but some people in town claimed they saw her ghost, standing in the window. "But she speaks to me in my dreams," I said, trying to make sense of it all. "Maybe her spirit is still here. Maybe she has unfinished business," Mrs. Brown said, her voice tinged with sorrow. Over the following nights, the dreams became clearer, darker. One night, I found myself in Martha's basement. The room was cold, damp, and in the center stood an old table covered with papers and photographs. Martha stood beside me, pointing at the papers. "This is what happened to me. This is what they want from you." I flipped through the pages and found her diary. She had written about a presence that had been following her for years, something she believed was bound to the house, something that wanted something from her, but she never knew what. In another dream, I saw Martha running, trying to escape from something. She rushed through the narrow halls of her house, then turned to me and said, "It watches me. It is watching you now." I decided to check my own basement. It was dark, damp, and I had barely explored it since moving in. As I descended the old wooden stairs, I noticed something strange about one of the walls. A wooden panel looked out of place. I pressed against it, and after a struggle, the panel slid open, revealing a hidden room. Dust and cobwebs clung to the air. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table covered in yellowed papers and photographs. I picked up one faded letter, its handwriting barely legible. "It watches me. I don't know what it is, but it wants something from me. I feel it in the darkness. It's everywhere. It is not human. It is something else." The letter was from Martha. I flipped through the pages. Her diary. She had been documenting the same presence that haunted my dreams. The same entity that had been watching her, now watching me. A suffocating dread crept over me. My hands trembled as I grabbed my things, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. As I rushed out of the house, I couldn't stop myself from glancing back at the opposite window. It was empty now, no sign of Martha. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the truth. I got into my car and drove away. Far from that town. Far from that house. I felt a fleeting sense of relief, but deep inside I knew the nightmares would never stop. I knew that whatever watched Martha now watches me. Some fears are more real than we believe. You may not see them, but they leave a mark that never fades. If you ever feel something watching you, if you ever feel you are not alone, don't ignore it. Some secrets are not meant to be discovered. Some doors are not meant to be opened. This was Jason's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. Have a horror story of your own? Drop it in the comments below. Your story might just be the next one we share.